Here we got a question straight off the review. It's given to us 9n cubed plus 18n squared minus 121n minus 242. The directions just say factor. So we got to figure out what method to use for factoring. How do we know which method to use? And this goes back to the notes. And I'm going to go ahead and walk you through step by step. So if you don't have the notes, or if you're not in my class and you're viewing this on YouTube, then you can go ahead and follow along. So there's a step of 4 things that you have to look for in order to figure out, okay, which method do I use first? And the first thing that we're going to look for is, do we have a greatest common factor between each and every one of these terms? So is there something that we can factor out first so we can make all these numbers smaller and make our lives a little bit easier while working out this problem? So here I can see we can pull out a 3 if we wanted to, but 3 cannot divide into these two numbers, so there is no GCF. So the first thing we're looking for is there a GCF? And in this case the answer is no. There is no number or variable that divides into all of these numbers. So the next thing we want to look for is, can we use the x factor? The x factor is when you have a trinomial. I'll go ahead and write something off to the side here, such that we have ax squared plus bx plus c. It's in that format, and we end up getting a factor that looks something like this, where we have x in the first term. But notice how we have 3 terms here and 4 terms here, so this method cannot be used at all. So we're going to go ahead and get rid of that. So since that method cannot be used, we're going to go ahead and look at the next thing. So let's just review here. The second thing we looked at is, can we factor by using the x factor? And that was no, because we have 4 terms here. It doesn't fit the ax squared plus bx plus c. So the third thing that we look for is, can we factor by grouping? Well, in a factor by grouping problem, you have 4 monomials adding or subtracting together, and you factor a GCF out of the first 2 and a GCF out of the second 2, so you group them. And judging by the look of this, it looks like it's fitting that format. I can factor something out of both of these, and then I can factor something out of both of these. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So looking at the first 2, so when we group, we're looking at the first 2 and the last 2 separately. So I'm focusing on this one. I have to figure out the GCF between 9n cubed and 18n squared. The GCF between the two of those is 9n squared. So I'm going to factor out a 9n squared. And in order to get what's inside my parentheses, I have to divide each term by the GCF. So when I divide this term by the GCF, the 9's cancel out. N cubed divided by n squared just gets me n. Then it'll be plus. Then I have to look at 18n squared divided by 9n squared. Well, the n squares are going to cancel out. 18 divided by 9 is 2. So that's the first part. Now we got to look at the second part. Looking at this second part, and here's the goal of factoring by grouping. When you factor by grouping, you have to get another set of parentheses with the same thing as what we got before. So what we look at is we figure out what number can we factor out of both of these, what is a GCF, in order to get an n plus 2 left over. Well, I'm looking at both of them and they're both negatives. So I got to factor out a negative in order to get positives left over on the inside. So I'm going to go ahead and write minus. So also think to yourself, what is 121n divided by what gives me n left over? Well, I can factor out a 121. Also, when I multiply, if I were to distribute this back, 121 times 2 will give me that 242, so that works out perfectly. So, in a factoring by grouping problem, this is what we have left over, but we're not done. If you look at each different color here as 2 separate terms, the common factor between them is n plus 2. So you can factor out an n plus 2. So here I have n plus 2. The order doesn't matter. You can list it first or last. Then you got to take what's left over. So I like to say that these are some guys that got kicked out. They're homeless. We got to give them a home. So we're going to give them their own home in 9n squared minus 121. So that is how you factor by grouping. But then you have to think to yourself, is there anything else I can do to factor. So the problem is, yeah, we factored by grouping, that's great, but you got to see, can I keep going? Can I factor more? If you cannot factor anymore, then you're done. But if you can, you got to keep going. So the n plus 2, that's pretty plain. There's really nothing to factor out in there. But looking at this, there's another type of factoring that we've talked about, and that's the fourth thing that we were looking at. The third was factoring by grouping. The fourth one is the difference of squares. Notice in difference of squares, you have two square numbers, and you're taking the difference, you're subtracting. And that is a certain format, certain formula that we'll go ahead and review right now. We still have the n plus 2 when we're factoring out. But then what we're going to do is we're going to take, I'm going to pick a different color here. We're going to take this right here and factor it out separately as two different parentheses. What you do is you take the square root of the first term. The square root of 9n squared is 3n. So you put 3n first. Your signs in between are always going to be plus minus. And then you take the square root of 121. Ignore the negative, it's taken care of for you in the formula. So the square root of 121 is 11. So you put that last. Then I want you to look at each set of parentheses again. Look at each set of parentheses again and figure out, is there anything else that I can factor? Do I have any square numbers? Is there a GCF inside one of these parentheses that I missed? And from the looks of it right now, it looks like we're done. So it looks like this is our final answer. So I'll go ahead and post this on Edmodo and go ahead and reply if you have any questions.